heard this week that Mother's Day is the day in the United States that the least crime is committed. And I really think that says a lot about how many crimes are usually being committed by our mothers who can't go out and do them. That must be one of the best jokes I've ever heard. Well, I was in a little bit of a pickle this week.
There it is.
Yeah. I was in a bit of a pickle because I had a pastor friend call me up and he asked me, how do you decide when you're coming up to Mother's Day if you're just going to keep preaching on what you have been preaching on, or if you write a special sermon for Mother's Day? And I told him, I don't know. So I asked Kayleen, she's a mother, which would she rather hear? She said, I don't care. So then I called my mom, and she said she didn't care either. So this is what I did to get out of my pickle. I wrote 2 sermons, all right? If you're a mother, you get a vote right now. My wife and my mother didn't choose. You all have to, all right? Do you want to hear the sermon about Mother's Day or the sermon from Genesis 15? If you want to hear about mothers, raise your hand. And if you want to... Only mothers. Owen tried to get a flower. Jezreel's trying to get a vote. All right. Any votes for Genesis? Just a few? All right. The Mother's Day sermon has it. And I'm going to tell you what, I'm really glad, because I can reuse the Genesis one next week. It would have been pretty weird if I came up here with the Mother's Day sermon next week. All right. Let's go ahead then and turn to Proverbs 31. Proverbs 31. Ray, I'm sorry I didn't look up the page number. You'll have to find it on your own. Now, if I just mentioned Proverbs 31, many of you will get a certain idea in your minds immediately. There's this somewhat nebulous idea of a Proverbs 31 woman. There's even a ministry called Proverbs 31 Ministries, which focuses on ministry to women. And depending on how you've interacted with Proverbs 31 in the past, whether you've read it for yourself or you've heard about it from some other source, you might be wary of hearing a Mother's Day sermon from Proverbs 31. When I told Kayleen that I might preach from Proverbs 31, she wasn't too excited for that. She thinks that the American church has perverted Proverbs 31 and made it into something that actually discourages or even harms women. To that I would say 2 things. First of all, if a passage of Scripture has been misused in the past and caused to harm people, we shouldn't avoid that passage of Scripture. We should teach it properly so as to redeem it and share the valuable truths that it actually contains. Proverbs 31 should be a great encouragement to women and to men, and it should enable them to live wisely in a variety of situations. The second thing that I would say to that, though, is that I actually plan to preach from the first 9 verses of this chapter, which come before the description of the Proverbs 31 women that everyone gets into their heads. At first glance, though, these first 9 verses might seem odd as a Mother's Day message, but if you give me a little bit of rope, I'll try to make sense of it without hanging myself. So if you please read from me from Proverbs 31, verses 1 through 9. The words of King Lemuel, an oracle that his mother taught him. What are you doing, my son? What are you doing, son of my womb? What are you doing, son of my vows? Do not give your strength to women, your ways to those who destroy kings. It is not for kings, O Lemuel. It is not for kings to drink wine or for rulers to take strong drink, lest they drink and forget what has been decreed and pervert the rights of all the afflicted. Give strong drink to the one who is perishing, and wine to those in bitter distress. Let them drink and forget their poverty, and remember their misery no more. Open your mouth for the mute, for the rights of all who are destitute. Open your mouth, judge righteously, defend the rights of the poor and needy. So the first thing that we need to cover here is, why is this appropriate for a Mother's Day sermon? In verse 1, we read that these few verses are the wise instructions from a mother to her son. You can see that in the rest of the verses as they're written in the second person as direct speech from this mother to her son. And of course, it's seen most clearly in a phrase we might all recognize in our own lives. What are you doing, my son? We might not have heard it said exactly like that, but who among us has never heard our own mother look at us and say, what are you doing? I think this is all very significant on Mother's Day because these words represent one of the few times in the Bible that we get teaching directly from a mother. There are certainly plenty of significant mothers in the Bible, but few of them offer direct teaching to us, like the mother of King Lemuel does here. Of course, as we study through the book of Genesis, we see Abraham and Sarah, who will be the mother of Isaac. And Sarah is used as an example of faith in Hebrews 11, and as an example of beauty and character in 1 Peter 3, so certainly you can study her. Moses' mother is a great example of bold faith as well, and we could continue by mentioning Hannah, the mother of Samuel, Elizabeth, the mother of John, Mary, the mother of Jesus, or even the few mothers who are specifically mentioned in the genealogy of Jesus, Rahab and Ruth and Bathsheba. These are each amazing women who are worth studying sometime, but what we don't get from them is direct teaching. We get the example of their lives, and a few of them even offer prophecy, but they don't give us direct instruction like the mother of King Lemuel here in Proverbs 31. So if you want to learn from their examples, choose one of them and study it. I would encourage you to do so. But if you want to learn from the instruction of a mother in the Bible, this is one of our best options. So that covers why we would study Proverbs 31, 1 through 9 this morning. And this is probably a good time to note that it's generally accepted that it's just these first 9 verses that are attributed to Lemuel and his mother. The rest of the chapter appears to have a different author. So the next question is, who on earth is Lemuel? I would bet that some of you who have been Christians for longer than I have no idea who Lemuel is. Hopefully you've read the book of Proverbs before, so you've encountered his name, but I bet you don't know who he actually is. I'm actually supremely confident that you don't know who he is because I spent this week studying Proverbs 31, and I still can't tell you who Lemuel is. He was a king, we know that, but we don't even know where he ruled. Some scholars take the Hebrew word oracle in this first verse and relate it to an Arabian tribe that perhaps Lemuel ruled. They would translate the verse a little bit differently then, but that isn't conclusive. We do know that there were no kings in Israel or Judah by the name of Lemuel, and we have no other mention of King Lemuel anywhere in the Bible, nor have we uncovered any other ancient documents referring to a King Lemuel. Fortunately, I don't think it's very important to know who Lemuel was. What is significant is that he was a king, but beyond that, his identity won't change our understanding of this passage. What's important is, like I said, that he was a king, and that leads us to perhaps the most important interpretive question that we have in this section. Is this advice that we get from his mother only for kings, or can it be applied more broadly? For instance, when it says, it is not for kings to drink wine, we need to know if that's just for kings, or if it is also for others who are perhaps in positions of authority or in government. In the United States, would this apply to the president, or to a governor, or a senator, or a mayor? Or maybe not political, in the business world, maybe would it apply to a CEO, or an administrator in a school, or a hospital? Or maybe this could be applied to everyone, even though it is directed to a king. Well, the long story short is that if I didn't think it was applicable to anyone other than a king, I wouldn't have decided to preach it this morning. Sure, we could honor mothers by pointing out this wisdom that was shared by a mother to her son, and a king no less, and recognizing that most of our own mothers have given us great wisdom over the years as well. These things are certainly true, and I hope we all recognize the wisdom of our mothers and thank them, if we're able, for what they've shown and taught us. But I also think that there's truth in the wisdom of Lemuel's mother, which is helpful even if we aren't kings. Which is good because as far as I know, none of us are kings. And even though we record this and we put it online, I don't think the reach of our online platform is going to hit any kings there either. So the question that I think we have to answer is, to what degree is this applicable beyond just kings? Well, I would say that this is primarily applicable to kings. It really is. So along those lines, anyone today who is in a similar position to that of an ancient king, because we don't have many kings in the world today, if you're in a similar position, you would do well to heed these words. Certainly someone like the president would benefit from heeding the words of Lemuel's mother. And I could go on down the list and mention a bunch of different positions and how closely this would apply to them or not. But I think it's probably more helpful to just draw out the guiding principle that connects an ancient king to those today whom would benefit from this. And that connection would be having a degree of power over other people. Some of that power is direct, like when a parent or a boss gives a direction to a child or an employee, and they need to go do that immediately. Other times that power is less direct, like perhaps when a politician gets a law passed, and that law then will be what impacts other people. But to the degree that anyone has power over another person, this wisdom can be applied. So most of us can apply this to at least some aspects of our lives. But what is the wisdom that we can be applying? Well, let's take it a bit at a time and see what we can learn. It begins, do not give your strength to women, your ways to those who destroy kings. Do women destroy kings? Is that what we're really going to teach here on Mother's Day? Well, first, we all need to understand the nature of Proverbs. The wisdom in the book of Proverbs is contained in short phrases that are designed to be memorable, but they are generally true, not completely true in all situations. The book of Proverbs often tells us how life works best, not necessarily how it works in all situations. So, of course, the point here isn't that women destroy kings. There's a modern proverb that we might be familiar with that says that behind every great man is a great woman. So, of course, a good wife would be of great benefit to King Lemuel. And a good spouse may be a benefit to most people. But the saying does carry some truth with it. Just think of two of the most famous kings in the Bible. King David suffered greatly because he failed to maintain proper relationships with his wives and with women in general. And King Solomon was led away from God and into idolatry by some of his 700 wives. As a point of advice, that's too many. The point of this here proverb, though, isn't that all women destroy kings, but rather that having improper relationships with women has certainly destroyed some kings. And kings, or people in positions of power, often have an easier time finding these improper relationships with women. If anyone other than King David had seen Bathsheba on a rooftop, they wouldn't have had the ability or the power to do much about it. But as king, David was able to bring her into his palace. Now, of these two proverbs, the one about women destroying kings and the one about behind a great man is a great woman, I think that Mark Twain balanced those well when he said, behind every successful man there is a woman, and behind every unsuccessful man there are two. I think President Clinton failed to keep this advice, and so has Donald Trump. I could go on the list, but that's probably broad enough on each end of the spectrum for you. But how many prominent pastors have we heard of who have failed to keep the advice of Lemuel's mother and destroyed not only their own lives, but their ministries? This advice is more significant for people with more power, because if they fall as a result, it affects more people. But even a relatively insignificant person with little to no power can still harm themselves and their families immensely by not maintaining proper relationships with their spouses or with men or women who are not their spouses in their lives. This proverb is truly for everyone. And it's a common theme throughout the book of Proverbs. It's not just here. For example, in Proverbs chapter 5, verses 18 through 20, we read, Let your fountain be blessed, and rejoice in the wife of your youth, a lovely deer, a graceful doe. Let her breasts fill you at all times with delight. Be intoxicated always in her love. Why should you be intoxicated, my son, with a forbidden woman, and embrace the bosom of an adulteress? And again in Proverbs 6, verses 20 through 26, we read these words, My son, keep your father's commandment, and forsake not your mother's teaching. Bind them on your heart always, tie them around your neck. When you walk, they will lead you. When you lie down, they will watch over you. And when you awake, they will talk with you. For the commandment is a lamp, and the teaching a light, and the reproofs of discipline are the way to life, to preserve you from the evil woman, from the smooth tongue of the adulteress. Do not desire her beauty in your heart, and do not let her capture you with her eyelashes, for the price of a prostitute is only a loaf of bread, but a married woman hunts down a precious life. I should note here that these examples throughout the book of Proverbs all speak of the problem being a woman or a wife. That's because all of these proverbs were written to a son. Had these been written to a daughter, the problem would be a man who is going out and seeking people to destroy their lives. So it goes both ways. Just understand that it's written this way because of who it was written to. But sexual purity is wise. Not only is it a part of how God designed us to flourish in his creation, it also gives us the best chance for success in everything that we do. God designed us to enjoy sex in the context of a married relationship between one man and one woman. But outside of that context, sex is commonly a source of strife and contention. And I would guess that most of our own mothers would agree with this wisdom, so we can honor our mothers this Mother's Day by listening to the wisdom of King Lemuel's mother. The next lines of wisdom are in verses 4 through 7, which say, It is not for kings, O Lemuel, it is not for kings to drink wine, or for rulers to take strong drink, lest they drink and forget what has been decreed, and pervert the rights of all the afflicted. Give strong drink to the one who is perishing, and wine to those in bitter distress. Let them drink and forget their poverty, and remember their misery no more. I'll just say, I didn't plan to hit all the hard topics on Mother's Day, but you guys picked this sermon. So. This section is a bit difficult because in order to understand it, we need to understand what the Bible in general and what Proverbs in particular teaches us about wine and alcohol. If we just take it by itself, what we would probably conclude is that kings and rulers shouldn't drink alcohol, while those who are poor and suffering should drink it, and that might lead us to set up a sliding scale from poverty to power, and as you go up the scale, you would drink less alcohol. And while I think there might be something to that scale, I think we need to consider a few other things first. I think we can start with Jesus. So first of all, I would note that Jesus drank wine. And I think it's probably also helpful to remember that he turned water into wine at a wedding feast, and it was no small amount of wine that he made. So while it's certainly appropriate for some people to avoid alcohol for a variety of reasons, we can't reasonably conclude from the Bible that we should rule it out entirely for everyone. I think that God has given us alcohol for our enjoyment, and as we see Jesus at the wedding feast, it appears to have a special role in our feasting and celebrating. But we should also note right away that there is a clear command from Ephesians 5:18 to not be drunk with wine. And then in 1 Corinthians 6:12, we read that all things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be dominated or controlled by anything. So we should be able to enjoy alcohol, but we need to enjoy it in moderation so that we are not controlled by it, either by intoxication or by addiction. So that's a taste of the broader biblical instruction about alcohol. Let's also consider what the book of Proverbs has to say outside of these verses. We find things like Proverbs 20, verse 1, which says, Wine is a mocker, strong drink a brawler, and whoever is led astray by it is not wise, which is a warning about the intoxicating power of alcohol to cloud our judgment and lead us into foolishness. And then Proverbs 21, verse 17 says, Whoever loves pleasure will be a poor man. He who loves wine and oil will not be rich, which teaches us that drinking too much alcohol can be an expensive habit, and it'll use up any wealth that we may be able to acquire. And then there's the longest instruction about alcohol in the book Proverbs. We find it in chapter 23, and it's verses 29 through 35. It says, "Who has woe? Who has sorrow? Who has strife? Who has complaining? Who has wounds without cause? Who has redness of eyes? Those who tarry long over wine, those who go to try mixed wine. Do not look at wine when it is red, when it sparkles in the cup and goes down smoothly. In the end, it bites like a serpent and stings like an adder. Your eyes will see strange things, and your heart utter perverse things. You will be like one who lies down in the midst of the sea, like one who lies on the top of a mast. They struck me, you will say, but I was not hurt. They beat me, but I did not feel it. When shall I awake? I must have another drink." This describes the problems of those who drink too much alcohol. Far from easing the burdens of the poor and the oppressed, like we see described in Proverbs 31, here we see their problems increasing. They are adding to their distress and poverty the additional problems of strife and complaining and wounds without cause, which I assume are either self-inflicted by the staggering walk of an intoxicated person or from the fighting and brawling that we find described in other places. But as we take all of this together, I think that what we find is this. Alcohol can cloud our judgment, and that's why it may need to be avoided by people who are in positions of power. But alcohol can also build up merriment, or it can dampen pain, so it can be a help to those who are suffering. So what I think we should conclude from this is that to the degree that you are in a position of power, you should be wary of alcohol. That doesn't mean it needs to be avoided completely, though once again, for some people, it would be wise to do so. It means instead that it shouldn't be allowed to cloud your judgment when it comes time to make decisions that impact other people. And the more people who would be impacted by your decisions, the more often that you have to make those impactful decisions, the less you should allow yourself to enjoy that merriment that God has given us in alcohol. On the other end of the spectrum, if you are suffering, feel free to enjoy a glass of wine or a bottle of beer or a shot of liquor. Allow it to take your mind off your suffering for a moment. But don't become dependent on it, and don't allow it to control you. Don't let it cloud your judgment to the point that you will make even your own situation worse. Now, I don't know about your mothers, but the wisdom of my own mother would be even stricter than what I just shared. So once again, I think we can honor our mothers by heeding the wisdom of King Lemuel's mother. Now let's finish with the last two verses of this section. "Open your mouth for the mute, for the rights of all who are destitute. Open your mouth, judge righteously, defend the rights of the poor and the needy." Once again, this is probably most important for people who are in positions of power. They have much more ability to defend the rights of the poor and needy. But in America, all of us have opportunities to speak up for the destitute. We can all make a difference. We can advocate for children in foster care or for single mothers, for the unjustly incarcerated or for the poor, even for the immigrants who arrive both legally and illegally because they are looking for a better future than they have in their homelands. We can advocate for the handicapped or for minorities. There's almost no end to the kinds of people who are treated unfairly, either by individual citizens or by corporations or by the government and the justice system. We may not have the power of a king to stand up for them and make sweeping changes immediately, but most of us can vote. Most of us could make financial contributions to ease their suffering, to give them justice. All of us can speak up when we hear someone speaking poorly for those who are in need of help. And I know we don't always like to admit it, but there are those who speak poorly of them here in Mott. There are racists here. There are people who despise the poor. There are people who pay no attention to the human dignity of criminals, who despite their transgressions are still made in the image of God and are so loved by Him that Jesus died even for them. This seems especially true if the crime in question is crossing the border in an unapproved manner or in an unapproved location. I would say that whether we are a prince or a pauper, each of us can do something to stand up for the needs of the destitute. Each of us can pursue justice. Each of us can learn from the teaching of King Lemuel's mother. and ultimately living a wise life, using the wisdom of King Lemuel's mother here, or the wisdom of the rest of the book of Proverbs, or more broadly, the wisdom of the Bible in general. Living that kind of wise life, that will honor our mothers. To drive that point home, let me conclude by reading Proverbs chapter 10, verse 1, which says, "A wise son makes a glad father, but a foolish son is a sorrow to his mother." Happy Mother's Day, and let me pray for us. God, we thank you for the many examples of godly mothers that we have, both in the Bible and in our lives. God, help us to honor our own mothers well by living wise lives. We thank you for the wisdom of King Lemuel's mother and the things that we can learn from her. We thank you for just the wisdom that you give us in the Bible more broadly, that we can learn from that and we can honor our mothers by living according to your word, not being the foolish who bring sorrow to our mothers. God, we thank you for our mothers, and we ask that you would help us to honor them well today. Amen.
Please stand for our